From Ticker News with Aaron Young, this is Ticker Today.
Hello, thanks so much for joining me. President Donald Trump flip-flopping once again today over hefty tariffs with his latest declaration slated for Liberation Day. The president says his tariffs are the reason foreign companies are setting up shop in the United States. The news about reciprocal tariffs now sending markets climbing, the Dow shooting up more than 500 points. We'll be joined by Oz Sultan later in the program to discuss. Heathrow Airport could have kept its operations running on Friday despite that fire at a nearby electrical substation, this according to Britain's National Grid. So why did Europe's busiest airport have to completely shut down? All eyes on the federal budget in Australia. The Treasurer Jim Chalmers set to announce one final surprise for cost of living relief, but will it actually help? This is Ticker Today, the latest news, business and tech shaping our world. So let's get started. First today, President Donald Trump is hesitating over charging countries hefty tariffs with his latest declaration slated for Liberation Day on the 2nd of April. Additionally, he's announced a hefty 25% tariff on nations buying oil or gas from Venezuela, staking it on top of existing duties that could reach 45% for certain trading partners. Markets reacting positively today, anticipating a potential retreat on the planned tariffs. Trump framed the tariffs as a response to Venezuela's actions and the surge of migrants, highlighting his administration's ongoing immigration efforts. He also says the tariffs are the reason foreign companies are now setting up shop in the United States.
First of all, many companies are now moving into the United States. They're coming back. Some of them left us from many years ago, decades ago, and they're all coming back. We have probably identified maybe $4 trillion worth of companies moving back or going to move back. Many of them have announced it's going to be tremendous jobs, high-paying jobs too. And you probably know the chip business, not because of the CHIPS Act, which was a disaster. You gave billions of dollars to companies that already have many billions of dollars. They said thank you very much. It was no incentive for them to use it. But what is good is the tariffs will make it so that they want to come back. That's why they're coming back. I think they're coming back because of the election that took place on November 5th and because of the fact that they have to come back because the tariffs are forcing them to come back.
Meanwhile, the Trump administration is currently investigating how a prominent magazine editor was unintentionally included in a group chat sharing sensitive US military plans. Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic reported he joined a Signal thread discussing airstrikes against Houthi militants in Yemen involving key administration officials. The National Security Council confirming the thread's authenticity, pledging to review the incident. Critics, including several Democrats, condemned the breach as a serious threat to national security, while some Republicans echoed calls for stricter safeguards. President Trump claimed he was unaware of the situation, stating he was hearing about it for the very first time.
I don't know anything about it. I'm not a big fan of The Atlantic. To me, it's a magazine that's going out of business. I think it's not much of a magazine, but I know nothing about it. You're saying that they had what?
They were using Signal to coordinate on sensitive materials and
having to do with what? Having to do with what? What were they talking about?
With the Houthis.
The Houthis? You mean the attack on the Houthis? Right. Well, it couldn't have been very effective because the attack was very effective. I can tell you that. I don't know anything about it. You're telling me about it for the first time.
Heathrow Airport could have kept its operations running on Friday despite a fire at a nearby electrical substation, according to Britain's National Grid. The National Grid confirming that alternate substations provided enough power to the busy airport, although it still faced significant challenges in safely restarting its operations. Heathrow's spokesperson indicated that hundreds of critical systems had to be powered down following the incident. Meanwhile, the International Air Transport Association, IATA, criticised Heathrow's reliance on a single power source and called for better planning to avoid future disruptions. Now let's talk about the Australian budget for Jim Chalmers, of course, the Australian Treasurer, who's making a significant step with this today. The Treasurer is set to unveil one final surprise ahead of the budget, which is due to try and deal with cost of living pressures. It comes on the back of billions spent on initiatives like GP visits, reduced medicine costs, a freeze on beer tax, and also $150 energy supplements. Government sources adding the budget won't touch housing or tax cuts. Now we know that the Treasurer says that the government has had major efforts in trying to deal with the cost of living and will be making further announcements in the budget. The White House is adjusting its approach to tariffs, now focusing on reciprocal tariffs slated for April 2. The sector-specific tariffs on industries like automobiles and pharmaceuticals are unlikely to be revealed as previously anticipated. President Trump aims to match tariffs imposed by major trading partners, but the administration is narrowing the focus to about 15 nations with significant trade imbalances, referred to as the Dirty 15. The shift suggests these nations should see steep tariffs, though the White House has yet to name them. For more, we're joined by Oz Sultan from Sultan Interactive Group. Great to see you, sir. Talk to us about what these tariffs mean and why the markets have reacted so strongly.
Well, it's been a series or a round of tariff plays in between the U.S. and Canada, as well as a number of trading partners. And what's interesting is that tariffs that have been levied upon American exports, largely steel, aluminum, a variety of consumer goods, have been in the 200% plus range with Canada. And so kind of trying to even the playing field, so to speak, for American producers. You know, the tariff conversation sort of ratcheted up. We've seen 2 to 3 Canadian companies announce that they are moving operations to the United States over the course of the past 2 weeks. And with this deadline looming, I think what's going to happen is it's going to become kind of a put up or shut up in between this policy coming out of Washington and the sort of confusing policy that we're getting out of Canada with Carney taking the helm, which is we may have increased energy tariffs that continue. We may have a reduction on tariffs on other American exports. But I think the net of what is going to happen, just given the fact that we've had so much capital movement into the U.S. for production, is that this is going to be beneficial to the U.S. And if Canada decides to continue to play hardball, they may be the losers inside this scenario.
Which is interesting because obviously the Liberal Party that Mark Carney has taken over from Justin Trudeau is now neck and neck in the polls with the Conservative Party. That hasn't been the case for quite some time, as Canadians are becoming quite patriotic around leadership against Donald Trump, who's essentially said tariffs or we annex the country.
Well, you know, I think, again, this is all negotiation tactics. And the simple fact is, for 4 years, we've had really no strength coming out of Washington. Now what you have is a perspective which is turn off the wars, end the funding for wars, move towards peace, and move towards settlement, you know, in a variety of different sectors. Trade is a big one. And, you know, Canada is one of our closest trading partners, should probably be treating us a little bit better than, you know, the multiple 100% tariffs that we have on a lot of American exports. But this will also be counterbalanced with things like Canadian softwood exports, which, you know, build our housing starts. So I think at the end of the day, you know, it's going to be a reset. How much of a reset and how the cards fall, that's April 2nd.
We've heard about the Dirty 15 and also the extra 25% tariffs on Venezuela.
Mm-hmm. No, that's correct. You know, and I think, again, a lot of these things are trying to reset trade relations around precious commodities like oil. Venezuela, one of the largest exporters of oil to the U.S., plus one of the largest exporters of heating oil, kind of looking at a Q3, Q4 perspective where we'd like to reduce those costs for American consumers. I think that's where these tariffs are starting to play. And I think we're getting the effects. It's now to the negotiators and the diplomats to kind of see what those final agreements become. But all of this is moving pretty steadily into, you know, coming to a head next week.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting one, and certainly watching the markets react there as well. Now, US universities are rapidly shifting from defiance to compliance with the Trump administration as they fear for their funding. Many institutions now hiring lobbyists and engaging with lawmakers to navigate the pressures from Washington following threats from Donald Trump to revoke federal support. Schools such as Columbia have begun to meet his demands to retain vital funding as lawmakers now prepare to hold hearings on controversial topics like anti-Semitism. University leaders now scrambling to defend their campuses and secure financial aid. Oz Sultan's joining us to discuss all this. And Oz, when we have a look at what's been happening on university campuses, historically, they've been rather progressive, left-leaning, some would say radicalised as well, and the Trump administration, as part of its agenda, really starting there, trying to end all that.
Well, you know, DEI was one of the first things that took a cut, and that was very big under the Obama administration and the Biden administration. But you didn't see jobs resulting from kids taking out $90,000 a year loans for degrees that were in, you know, not civics, not political science, not technology, but really more conceptual frameworks of degrees that didn't have, you know, direct correlation to jobs. And then secondarily, on top of this, you know, we're seeing the challenge of anti-Semitism vis-a-vis the question of, you know, legal and due protest. I think where we're sitting right now is, you know, the government has seen a lot of anti-American sentiment inside of the protests. There's an intent to nip this in the bud. There's a big looming question of the rights of Palestinians inside of this, but that seems to be something that gets buried under conversations that happen about Hamas on campuses on a consistent basis. So, you know, pulling back on funding where we're having anti-American sentiment, I think, is the first piece of this. But now universities kind of trying to figure out how they play inside of this landscape is where we have lobbyists coming in, and we're going to have a whole bunch of consultants that are going to position themselves to try and help these organizations navigate what is now an increasingly complicated landscape in Washington.
I think it goes back, some say, to the Vietnam War protests and that era, the Nixon era, where essentially students stood up against the Republican administration. What are your views on that? How did we get to this stage, as you say, where a lot of students are going to university or to college to learn things that don't lead to a job?
Well, I think part of it really kind of stemmed from the Obama administration saying that they would take a lot of conceptual topics and turn them into potential government jobs. And you had a lot of this growth, you know, intersectionality, understanding, conceptual understanding of race and rhetoric, things that don't necessarily bring Americans closer together or actually solve problems, but are things that are more attuned to really be living in academia than living inside of the governmental bureaucracy. And I think that's really where the challenge is, because you had two, you know, cycles of Obama and one cycle of Biden, effectively roughly about 16 years, where we were telling Americans from the presidency down that there'll be jobs for you for these types of things. And the net is there aren't, right? And now I think the DEI move really is looking future forward at the fact that AI is going to cut 30% of what we have in jobs now. We really need to trim the fat, but at the same point in time, there needs to be some guidelines with universities in terms of how we, you know, allow anti-American sentiment from non-Americans. If you're American, say whatever you want, but if you're here on our courtesies, you know, maybe pick your battles.
Yeah, all right. Ant Group, backed by Jack Ma, has harnessed Chinese semiconductors to create AI training techniques that could slash costs by 20%. The firm utilised domestically made chips from its affiliate Alibaba and Huawei, achieving results comparable to NVIDIA's high-end H800 processors. You remember what happened to the market when DeepSeek came around. Now, although still using NVIDIA for AI development, Ant is now increasingly leaning on alternatives, including chips from AMD and local sources too. The development signifies Ant's entry into the competitive sphere of AI, aiming to match the capabilities of US tech giants. We're being joined by Oz Sultan from the Sultan Interactive Group. Now, when we think about what happened with DeepSeek just a month or so ago and the impact it had on the market, when you could see that these cheaper chips really what it would do to the market darling of NVIDIA. Now we're seeing domestically produced AI chips, not cheaper NVIDIA, but domestically produced chips. In this Bloomberg exclusive article, what do you think will happen?
So it's interesting. DeepSeek had actually, with the export restriction in place, gotten their hands on 20 to 40,000 of the H series chips, a mixture of 100s, 200s, and 800s. That was really what was running them, for the first couple of weeks, and then they had throughput issues, right? So the Ant announcement is interesting, and the benchmarking really needs to be sussed out. But I'll tell you that the large language models are typically using anywhere between 20,000 to 40,000 of these GPUs if they're operating on the level that DeepSeek stands or wants to operate on. And it becomes a big question of two things. Number one, how are they going to manage these code bases? Because the NVIDIA chips run slightly different than the Ant chips. And number two, will you actually be able to get that much horsepower out of the Ant chips? And if you're using a mixed methodology of chips, how is this going to stack up when you need to actually hit crunch time and you need to almost overclock these things to keep up with demand? So the energy consumption aspect of this is very interesting. That's at least heartwarming. But the applicability of these chips to really compete head to head against the NVIDIA chips, I don't think we've fully seen yet. And we definitely haven't seen it on scale. So I think a lot is yet to be gleaned from this. It's a good start by China in terms of catching up, but I still think that there's a tremendous amount of catching up to do versus NVIDIA's cloud clustering systems and even their desktop supercomputer that's available for $3,000.
All right. So Oz, when it comes to what they're actually trying to do here, are they trying to compete with US chip makers, or are they trying to impact the US economy?
A little bit of both. You know, when we saw some of the errors being thrown from DeepSeek, when your queries were asked that would have violated OpenAI's terms of service, you got OpenAI errors inside of DeepSeek. And I documented this on my Twitter a couple weeks ago, Oz for NY. But what you're really looking at right now is this is an arms race. And this is an arms race for not just computing horsepower, but also how much computing horsepower can be deployed with the minimum amount of power consumption. Because these H100s, 200s, and the higher level ones consume 700 watts per hour. So you get 1,000 of these, that's 7 megawatts. If they've got a 20% reduction, that's great. They're at 5, you're somewhere between 6 and 7. But the big question still is, can these perform at the same level? Can they process tokens, which effectively is like 3 bytes of data, at the same level? And can they deliver at the same level? And I think we're going to see that in the coming months. This is a definite move by them to position themselves for relativity inside of this market space. But we'll see how powerful they are, the more that folks use this, and what they see as the challenges with DeepSeek 1. Do those continue with, the Jack Ma AI as well as DeepSeek 2?
Yeah, very much so. It's going to be interesting to see what they come up with next to try and impact the AI market and potentially Wall Street as well. Oz Sultan, really appreciate your time here on Ticker as always. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Wall Street showing signs the worst of the US stock sell-off may be behind us, although experts remaining cautious about jumping back into equities just yet. Major indexes experienced a bounce Monday as news emerged of President Trump's more controlled tariff strategy, easing fears over inflation and economic slowdown as well. Now, some investors are optimistic today, with key stocks making notable recoveries after a very challenging period marked by significant losses. Analysts point to a variety of factors, including a decrease in the US dollar and a shift in sentiment as potential triggers for a rally in the near future. However, uncertainty surrounding upcoming trade policies continues to keep some on the sidelines as they await for clearer signals.